Hello again, and welcome to Denton's Tales. Sometimes the introduction of something alien to an existing society can have unfortunate consequences, to say the least, as in the case of non-native animal species. Cats, for example, that destroyed many native bird populations that had no fear of them and thus fell very easy prey. Ideas, too, can alter indigenous peoples' culture and attitudes, not always for the best. Sometimes replacing excellent and decent aspects of society with totally alien ones that were less so. For many hundreds of years, the Norse people had worshipped the gods of Asgard, or Asgard as it is in English, Odin, Freya, Thor, Tyr, and so forth, bringing their faith with them as they settled abroad, using their amazing ships to spread out across most of Europe and far beyond, founding settlements in Ireland, many parts of England, Scotland, Wales, the Orkney, Shetland and Faroe Islands, the Isle of Man, Iceland, Greenland and Francia, in what would become Russia, Belarus and the Ukraine, even crossing to what is now Newfoundland and going further south to New Brunswick in mainland Canada, which they called Vinland. They were the greatest explorers, traders, merchants and settlers of the early Middle Ages. And pretty good at raiding too. Yeah, they were quite good at that. Influencing the known world more than anyone else since the Roman Empire, although even Rome had never gone further west than Wales. But Christianity began to creep into Scandinavia and the Norse settlements abroad during the 9th century. Something that would drastically alter the beliefs and the traditions of the Norse people. The new faith from Palestine was a rigidly structured one, with rules and regulations that had to be adhered to. Everything was scripted and ordered, the complete opposite of the old pagan, free and very personal worship. And it demanded total obedience, changing the Scandinavian world almost totally. Was that a beneficial change, or did it take away much of the noble and honourable aspects of Norse society? Was it in fact the real Ragnarok? Well, before answering that question, which we'll probably come to at the end of part 2 of this video, let's look at how those changes came about. It's quite an interesting story in itself. The first conversion attempts in Sweden occurred in 830 AD, when Ansgar, Archbishop of Hamburg and Bremen, was invited by King Bjorn to come and spread the faith, which he did. Well, at least he came and he built a church at Birka, though he achieved very little faith spreading as a result. The Swedes, well, they just weren't interested. They were sort of Christianity? Boring. 100 years later, another Archbishop of Hamburg tried, but really didn't do very much better. The Archbishops of Hamburg were clearly very keen on converting the Swedes, but the Swedes themselves were decidedly unconvertible, though missionaries from England had some success in Västergötland. Sweden's first Christian king, Olaf, ascended the throne in 995 AD, and he used some diplomacy, you could say, to help the new faith, making a mutual toleration pact with the great pagan temple at Uppsala, the site of the Althing, as well as a former royal residence that had considerable influence among pagans. Though, to be fair, that probably had more to do with the fact that he wasn't powerful enough at that time to force compliance with his wishes than it did with any genuine tolerance he might have had. But it enabled him to eventually set up an episcopal see in the year 1000 AD. Another episcopal see was established around 1060 AD by King Stenkel, when, though a very devout Christian, he was also a tolerant man, and he accommodated pagan beliefs to some extent. However, later kings were not quite as accommodating, and around 1084 AD there was an attempt by King Inge the Elder to stamp out the traditional pagan sacrifices that were held at Uppsala. but that there was still enough pagan presence in Sweden to rise up against the king because of this, and he was forced into exile, and his brother-in-law, Blotsvein, became king. But, and this is quite a considerable but, only after he agreed to retain the Uppsala sacrifices. But Inge returned in secret in 1087, surrounded his brother-in-law's hall, and burned it, killing Blotsvein as he attempted to escape, then regained the throne and largely completed the Christianization of Sweden. The final act in that process was when the episcopal see, founded by King Stenkel, was moved, sometime between 1134 and 1140, to Uppsala, in what was obviously a very strong message to pagans that Christianity had arrived and was there to stay, firmly established in the very heart of paganism. And in 1164, the Pope established the Archdiocese of Sweden at Uppsala. Again, this was a very strong message to the pagans. We are in your former headquarters, and we're not going anywhere. In Denmark, the first missionaries are said to have arrived as early as 710 AD, but they met very little success, the Danish king being polite but uninterested, and taking no action against the missionaries. He didn't ill-treat them, he didn't torture them, he didn't kill them. He just more or less said, thank you very much, but whatever you're selling, no, we already have one and we don't want it. And that was in stark contrast to what would have happened had they been preaching paganism to the average Christian king, which would have ended rather badly. Probably in a barbecue in the town square, with them being the barbecue. Tolerance was not a great feature of the early church, it must be said. Around 823 AD, there was another attempt to interest the Danes in the new faith, but again it met with indifference, though the exact details of these early efforts by Christians are a bit uncertain. They are sort of clouded to some extent by myth and legend that became attached to them. But the Danes had had considerable exposure to Christianity quite early on in the Viking Age. Their raids on England and Ireland not only giving them some insight into the religion, which they would have known quite a bit about, but also bringing back numerous Christian captives to use as thralls, or even to marry in the case of any attractive women they might have acquired. How these Christians were treated depended really on the local jarl in most cases, rather than a king. You see, the Danes at that time were very tribal in that regard, local leaders liking to make their own decisions regarding captives and attitudes towards them, rather than having someone with a golden thingy on his head sitting on a throne miles away and telling them what to do. They weren't really into that sort of thing. But some of them saw an advantage in converting to Christianity, since as time went on, the Danes were having increasing dealings, both militarily and in trade, with Christian countries, England, Ireland, Francia, and the Christian descendants of the Vikings who had founded Normandy. And since Christians were actually forbidden by the church to trade with pagans, and it was their holy duty to kill pagans as well, and your trade was a tad difficult with people who were under orders to kill you. So being Christian not only had great trading benefits, but it also might prevent being attacked by God-fearing Christians trying to rid the world of the evil pagans. So some jarls converted, not of course from any religious conviction, but rather for convenience. And then many of their retainers would do the same, and often the people they governed would follow suit. A sort of religious follow the leader, which makes sense when you think about it. So Christianity spread a bit at a time. And the missionaries, now the missionaries were very, very clever. They noticed how pagan holy sites would be situated in groves of trees or beside sacred wells or springs. And they came up with psychology long before Sigmund Freud thought of it. So they built churches or little chapels at those same sites, being very respectful and getting permission beforehand so as not to offend anyone nor appear as threatening in any way. See, they would have wanted to be seen as perhaps honouring the Norse gods by worshipping beside them, rather, of course, than their actual purpose, which was to supplant them altogether by using them to draw in their followers by association, if you like. And over time, that began to work. The religious association of the particular pagan site attaching itself to the adjoining church as well. And if the church had been built, say, in or near a sacred grove, well, wood from those trees might have been used in the construction to add to the pagan association with it and subtly influence the people. They could hardly say to the Danes, if we told you our God is better than your gods, you wouldn't listen to us. But if we build our places of worship beside your places of worship, you will come to see our God as the same as your gods. And then we've got you, mate, haven't we? Oh, yes. No, they were rather, economical with the truth about that. They also utilized the popular image of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Being as it was a T shape, you see, it could be altered slightly. You just turn it that way and you drop this bit down here, and what have you got? You have got a cross. Again, rather subtle. But a lot of people were hedging their bets, you might say, as far as converting went, accepting the new faith, but worshipping it jointly with pagan beliefs, taking the body and blood of Jesus Christ at communion one day and leaving gifts and offerings to the gods or the guardian spirits of the land the next day, thus covering themselves both ways. And talk about hedging your bets. One of the beliefs had to be right, and by following both, they had a winner, didn't they? Again, it did make sense. The final conversion of all Denmark, or at least, officially so at least, occurred around 975 AD, when the formerly pagan king Harald Gormson, better known as Harald Bluetooth, who had been himself converted around 960 AD, with some of his family members following suit, and he formalized the new faith as the religion of Denmark. Though he had permitted Christian missionaries to work and preach publicly when he was still a pagan, having been quite a tolerant ruler in that regard, though he did try to force his beliefs on Norway, as we shall see. But though Denmark was now officially Christian, pagan ideas, they still held sway among the people to some extent, and they could pop up in surprising ways, as happened as late as 1086 AD, when King Knut IV Svensson was murdered by peasants who he had angered by his increasingly overbearing demands and the imposition of powers no previous king had ever had, and that pissed off quite a few people. And he was killed in a church in front of the altar, we are told, with a spear, according to an account by a contemporary chronicler. Now, no trace of a spear wound was found on his body by archaeologists. It appeared actually that he'd been bashed over the head with a rock or something similar. But of course, a spear thrust wouldn't leave any trace unless it hit bone, and you could shove a spear through someone a number of times without actually hitting bone. So he may well have been killed with a spear and bashed with a rock for good measure afterwards, just to make sure that the spear had done its job properly. But that the spear was a symbol of Odin, and sacrificing the king or any other important person to Odin with a spear in a sacred place, that would fit with aspects of Old Norse belief. And so King Knut may well have been sacrificed in a sacred place, admittedly a church, but a sacred place nonetheless, with a spear, even though the peasants were by that time Christian, or, nominally so. But pagan symbolism may well have been present, even if only subconsciously. In Norway, Christianity didn't show itself until well into the 10th century. King Håkon Haraldsson, known as Håkon the Good, the son of King Harald Finehair, who ruled from 934 to 961 AD, made the first recorded attempt to bring Christianity to Norway. Rather unsuccessfully, as it turned out. Scandinavia wasn't really interested to begin with. Now, you see, he wasn't an intolerant man, and he didn't try to use force to convert people. He was quite happy to allow those who wished to remain pagan to do so. Those convinced against their will remain of the same opinion still, as the phrase goes. And he simply tried to influence them, if you like, to change faith, realizing that a forced conversion has little genuine religious acceptance in it, unlike a later Norwegian king who was quite the opposite. We shall come to him. Håkon even decreed that the Norse midwinter festival, Yule, and the Christian Christmas should be celebrated together, moving the date of the pagan celebration back from January to coincide with that of the Christian one, integrating their respective practices to some extent, probably hoping that this would, it would induce more people to convert to their new faith. It would get them interested in it. And he helped that along with alcohol. Always a good way to get people together, you know. But yes, that was quite a subtle idea. And, drinking was something the Norse were rather good at to begin with, though it was the first time they'd been ordered to do it by royal decree. The king ordered that each free man must drink what was approximately 4 gallons of mead or ale over the Yule Christmas festivities, and continue to celebrate it until every drop was gone. As long as there was a drop left, you kept on celebrating by order of the king. The only legislation in history that punished someone for not getting drunk. See, not doing one's alcoholic duty would incur a fine. While no doubt greatly enjoying the king's alcoholic decree, his efforts were generally unpopular with the people, and they didn't produce any mass conversions to the new faith, though perhaps quite a few hangovers. A subsequent ruler, the Christian King Harald Greycloak, literally grey hide in the translation, he went the opposite way, wanting to wipe paganism away, just wipe it off the map. And he put some considerable effort into destroying pagan hofs or temples. But he didn't have any success with the spreading the faith part, so his hof destroying was probably rather a waste of time. Then paganism got not only a reprieve, but actually a considerable boost, with a very pagan Jarl Håkon Sigurdsson, known as Håkon the Powerful. And when he came along, a man who may have actually been related to the famous Ivar the Boneless, and was the Earl of Lada, a title he acquired after his father was murdered by Harald Greycloak, and the two engaged in no little conflict. But with the help of Denmark's King Harald Bluetooth, Håkon was able to kill his father's murderer in 971, taking control of Norway as a vassal of Harald, and helping the Danish king against the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. Now, Jarl Håkon was a firm believer in the Old Norse gods, something that didn't sit too well with the Danish king, who in 975 AD forced him to be baptized as a Christian, and gave him a number of missionaries to take back with him to spread the faith in Norway. Håkon decided, after his water dunking, that he'd had enough of Bluetooth and Christianity, and just as he was about to set sail, he ordered the clergyman off his ship, and he put to sea. Yes, he chucked them off the ship and put to sea, probably very quickly, leaving them on the quayside. Thus he broke his allegiance to Harald Bluetooth and to Denmark, becoming the de facto ruler of Norway from then until 995 AD. And he began reversing the rather ineffectual efforts of his predecessor, enthusiastically rebuilding the destroyed hofs and re-establishing the worship of the old gods. He had considerable influence, actually, in other areas as well, such as when Prince Vladimir of Novgorod fled to Norway after being driven out of Rus by his brother Yaropolk of Kiev, and Håkon assisted him to raise an army and return to Rus, oust his brother, and take the throne as Grand Prince Vladimir I of Kiev. But though Håkon's revival of the old ways had gained him considerable support among the pagan jarls, his later considerable arrogance, unfortunately that lost him much of that support, and there was a rebellion against him, resulting in his being murdered by one of his own men, a thrall and trusted friend named Tomud Kark. So much for trusted friends. And he was killed as the two men hid from the rebels in a pigsty. It's not a very romantic death, to put it mildly. His successor was a former pagan, now turned Christian, his direct opposite, in fact, a more than dedicated Christian, who would try extremely aggressive methods to save the souls of his people from his perceived idea of the evils of paganism. We shall come to him in a moment. In some places, the Norse began converting to Christianity without any great pressure at all put on them. They weren't forced to do so, they just converted because they chose to do so for various reasons, most notably perhaps here in Ireland. The classic example of the tolerance and acceptance shown by the Norse people for those they settled among, where intermarriage and the resulting assimilation between Danes, Norwegians and the native Irish became more frequent as time went on, until eventually there was little real difference between the Irish and the foreigners as far as identity and even religion went. You'd have been hard put to it to spot any difference between a Gael and a Dane in Ireland by the early 11th century. For example, the great Hiberno-Norse king of Dyflin, or Dublin as it's called now, Sidrika Olafsson, known as Silkbeard, who ruled on and off from 995 to 1036 AD, was the son of a Norse nobleman and an Irish princess. Such a union was really the norm by that time, and he himself was a Christian, who not only went on a pilgrimage to Rome, but also founded Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral, the oldest surviving building in the city, though his original building had been made of wood. That is what makes the popular image of King Brian Boru driving the heathens from Ireland, saving the holy land of Erin from the evil pagans, rather ridiculous, since he'd have had a bit of a job to find very many pagans by that time to drive out. And at the famous Battle of Clontarf in 1014, the Norse and the Dyflin Irish, well, they joined forces and they fought together against the land-grabbing King Brian, who, very far from wanting to drive anybody out of anywhere, simply wanted the kingdom of Dyflin for himself, regardless of who controlled it. In part 2 of this video, I'll be looking at a man who used more direct methods of conversion than the rather weak, hey, let's all get drunk together tactics of King Håkon. A man who didn't beat around the bush. Oh, no, he didn't offer you a drink. Oh, not by a long way. He was direct and to the point. He gave people a very simple, easy to understand choice. Convert or suffer torture and death. Basic and straight to the point. Convert or die. Well, with some economic restrictions thrown in. His name was Olaf Tryggvason. Now, watch this space for further videos. Keep an eye out for part 2. Goodbye for now.